Welcome back. Continuing from last time, we turn now to the unique concept of martyrdom in the Isles. We know this phenomenon through the document of the Cambrai Homily. This is the earliest existing Irish homily or sermon, which dates from the late 7th or early 8th century, written in both Old Irish as well as Latin. Within it we find the description of 3 martyrdoms of Celtic monastic life: the red martyrdom, the blue or green martyrdom, and the white martyrdom. If you recall back to Lesson 4, we defined martyrdom as being a Christian tradition where one witnesses the faith in Christ in a radical way, even to the point of death. In early Christian tradition, both St. Jerome and St. Gregory the Great had already referred to 2 types of martyrdom, the red and the white. This document is the first time that we see the term blue or green martyrdom appear. In readings you may see one term or the other, as scholars still argue over which is the proper translation of the color mentioned. What does each color mean exactly? The red martyrdom indicates a martyrdom that draws blood, where the individual dies for their faith. The red martyrdom was quite rare in Ireland before the Viking invasions of the 8th century, due in part to the accommodative spirit in which it expanded and it maintained many continuities with pre-Christian culture. Think back to our initial paradox of the continuity and discontinuity of traditions within the Isles. Although Irish Christians did not experience the red martyrdom, there was still a deep desire to emulate the Christian martyrs who died for their faith during the various persecutions. They did this via symbolic deaths. One such death is the white martyrdom, which refers to a strict asceticism to the point of separation from all of one's earthly desires and all of one's earthly loves. Recall here Saint Anthony the Great and his radical asceticism in the deserts of Egypt. What we have as well in the Isles is the blue or green martyrdom. This includes fasting and penitence. This martyrdom included a variety of practices and degrees available for all Christians, not just strict ascetics or monastics. One of the traditions that emerges from this concept of martyrdom is the peregrinatio pro Christo. This is Latin for pilgrimage, or an exile for Christ. It is sometimes simply referred to as a peregrinatio. The Latin term is retained over the colloquial language, specifically to differentiate itself from the more common notion of pilgrimage as a journey to a sacred site or person. A peregrinatio is the practice of leaving and living away from one's homeland as the ultimate ascetical act of white martyrdom. Recall from lesson number 4, St. Columba leaving his home to travel away to eventually settle on the Isle of Iona. In the ancient world, including Ireland, exile was a sentence sometimes prescribed for punishment for certain infractions. Within the insular penitentials, that is, the prescriptive guidelines for penitences to heal specific sins, exile, even temporary or permanent, could be assigned to an individual as a way to heal specific sins. In cases of a sea peregrinatio, often the peregrini, or the individual undergoing the journey, would use a currach, as seen here. These are small boats made of hide, which would have been used by the peregrini both at the time we're speaking of as well as centuries later. Turning now to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we see here an example of this blue or green martyrdom. And 3 Scots came to King Alfred in a boat without any oars from Ireland, whence they stole away, because they would live in a state of pilgrimage for the love of God, they cared not where. The boat in which they came was made of 2 hides and a half, and they took with them provisions for 7 nights. And within 7 nights they came to land in Cornwall, and soon after went to King Alfred. Within this example we see then individuals who left on a peregrinatio and who took off from the mainland without even oars, allowing the boat to go wherever the Lord would will. Another example of this is seen in the life of Saint Columbanus. He is one of the most renowned of the Irish Peregrini, and will be found in texts variously as Columbanus or Columban. We know of him through his Vita, written shortly after his death by Jonas of Bobbio. Bobbio is a city in northern Italy and is the location of the last monastery founded by Columbanus. It is also where he is buried. Columbanus was the author of a highly influential monastic rule, a penitential, several letters, and sermons which all still exist, as well as some Latin verses and songs. You have already encountered some of these throughout lesson number 5. Seen here is a stained glass window portraying St. Columbanus in St. Bridget's Church in San Francisco. In 587, with the permission of his abbot, St. Columbanus set off on his peregrinatio with 12 companions from Bangor Monastery in Ireland. From there he went to Gaul, where he established many monasteries, but after a conflict with Frankish nobility, he plied the rivers of Europe through what is now Germany, Switzerland, and finally settled in Italy, founding monasteries all along the way. St. Columbanus is not the only individual to come into trouble with nobility on the continent, and we will see the effects of these confrontations in Lesson 6. St. Columbanus's monastic rule, which is a life guide for monks, was very influential on the continent, although it would gradually be replaced by the rule of St. Benedict somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries. His rule advocates prayer, austerity, penitence, and manual labor. Much in the same vein of the Peregrinatio is a mission undertook by the monastics of the Isles to the Anglo-Saxons. This mission was directed towards prominent Germanic and non-Christian culture in the east and north of England in the early Middle Ages. The mission occurred from 2 directions. From the northwest, monks from the Irish-founded monasteries of Iona set out at the request of King Oswald of Northumbria. Of these, the most successful, although not the first monk to travel to Northumbria, was Saint Aidan. Saint Aidan was known as an intelligent and sensitive teacher who ministered to all levels of society. He established the monastic settlement and cathedral on the tidal island of Lindisfarne, which is now known as the Holy Island. Seen here is a modern sculpture of Saint Aidan near the ruins of the 12th century monastery at Lindisfarne, which was built on the side of Aidan's original settlement. In addition to this first movement from Iona to Lindisfarne, there was another movement as well from Canterbury up to Lindisfarne as well. You can see here the 2 directions converging on Lindisfarne. The second group was sent by Pope Gregory the Great, who asked St. Augustine to go on a mission from Rome to the Anglo-Saxons 1 year later. Note this is not the famous St. Augustine of Hippo, but rather St. Augustine of Canterbury. Much as how today the names James and John are quite common, the name Augustine was common at the period. St. Augustine was consecrated as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Ethelbert's wife, Bertha, was already a Christian who had a Frankish bishop with her in the court of Kent. Members from this Roman mission eventually moved from the southeast up towards Northumbria. In 664, the missions from Iona and Rome would meet together at the Synod of Whitby, hosted by St. Hilda, who we met in Lesson 4. Eventually, through this synod, the Roman customs would prevail over those of the Isles. Turning now to another influential saint from Lindisfarne is St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was originally a Northumbrian, so an Anglo-Saxon monk and bishop. He was at first a monk at Melrose, where the customs of Iona, which were brought by St. Aidan, were practiced. From there he went to a new monastery at Ripton, where Roman customs were practiced. So in the figure of St. Cuthbert, we see someone who has actually been exposed to both traditions. After the Synod, St. Cuthbert accepted Roman customs and was chosen to reintroduce those back to Lindisfarne. much as the hagiographical figures of St. Patrick, St. Bridget, and St. Columba. St. Cuthbert is an individual who reconciles peoples. Whereas the first three are concerned with the continuity and discontinuity of the Isles' pre-Christian past with their new Christian reality, St. Cuthbert is a figure who both transcends and reconciles the different groups of the Christianity practiced in the Isles and the Christianity practiced on the continent. He embodies the hybrid spirit of the insular Christian culture. St. Cuthbert eventually retired to the Isles off of Lindisfarne, where he lived as a hermit among his beloved birds and other creatures. By 10 years after his death, he was already revered as a saint. The Lindisfarne Gospels were produced in memory of him in the first quarter of the 8th century. Seen here again is the Lindisfarne Gospels. There's a link below in the description where you can actually go through the Lindisfarne Gospels and turn the pages. Seen here is St. Cuthbert's coffin, which is a fragmentary oak coffin, now in Durham Cathedral. Between the time of his death and about 1827, it did contain the remains of the saint, whose tomb is still within the same cathedral. Turning to the words of the Venerable Bede on St. Cuthbert, he used mainly to visit and preach in the villages that lay far distant among the high, inaccessible mountains, which others feared to visit and whose barbarity and squalor daunted other teachers. He taught others to do only what he first practiced himself. Above all else, he was afire with heavenly love, unassumingly patient, devoted to unceasing prayer, and kindly to all those who came to him for comfort. His self-discipline and fasting were exceptional, and through the grace of contrition, he was always intent on the things of heaven. Lastly, whenever he offered the sacrifice of the saving victim of God, he offered his prayers to God not in a loud voice, but with tears welling up from the depths of his heart. In Bede's words we hear one of our initial paradoxes, that St. Cuthbert exhibits a strict asceticism, yet a generosity and a gentleness to his fellow created beings. Bede wrote further on St. Cuthbert, he, St. Cuthbert, was in the habit of rising at the dead of night, while everyone else was sleeping, to go out and pray, returning just in time for morning prayers. One night one of the monks watched him creep out, then followed him stealthily to see where he was going and what he was about. Down he went towards the beach beneath the monastery, and out into the sea until he was up to his arms and neck deep in water. The splash of the waves accompanied his vigil throughout the dark hours of the night. At daybreak he came out, knelt down on the sand, and prayed. Then 2 otters bounded out of the water, stretched themselves out before him, warmed his feet with their breath, and tried to dry him off on their fur. They finished, received his blessing, and slipped back into their watery home. He was soon home, and was in the choir at the proper time with the rest of the monks. Here we see a slightly different version of the same paradox. On the one hand, he did go to perform his vigil, neck deep in water, yet there is also the moment with the 2 otters, which reminds us of that deep respect and connection with nature. On the words of Bede, speaking of St. Cuthbert, we end our time together today. Next time we'll be taking a look at the maturing and changing world in which Celtic Christianity finds itself. See you next time.